Okay, we're continuing our lecture on parts of the plant body and the tissue makeup of the parts of the plant body. And we introduced the three major types of tissue and saw where they're located here in this diagram: the vascular, the dermal, the vascular, and the ground. Uh, and now we're going to look at a few images of some of these in more detail. So here is a root cross section. It's an actual microscopic image of a root cross section, and you can see right here in the center, they've added some dye to the tissue, and so the xylem tissue is standing out right here, and it makes an X right in the middle of the root. And then the kind of aqua blue color here surrounding it is your phloem tissue, and that's the vascular tissue in the root. So we're starting to look specifically at the part of the plant body makeup here with the root. Now the root has a layer of dermal tissue that surrounds it called the epidermis, and that's this line right there is the epidermis. And then it has everything else that's in the middle of the root right here is called the cortex. All right, so that's the makeup of the root. Now the next slide, this slide is looking at the makeup of the stems. And so here we have, now this is where we have different makeups in monocots and dicots. When we just looked at the root, we had one image, and it's the same for monocots and dicots. That's the tissue arrangement in roots of monocots and dicots. But in the stem, there's a different way tissue is arranged. So dicots, the stem is formed. You have an epidermis, outer layer of the stem. You have your vascular tissue that is close to that epidermis. It forms a circle just inside the epidermis, and that vascular tissue is made up of xylem and phloem. All right, and then you have some ground tissue right in the center, and that is referred to as a pith. Here you have just no vascular tissue, just a pith, and sometimes this will form a hollowing of the stem in the dicots. Now in the monocots, you see it looks different here. You still have an epidermal layer, epidermis around the outer portion of the stem, but the vascular tissue does not form that thick ring around. It has smaller vascular sections that run all through the plant body. And so the vascular bundles are smaller, but they're more numerous. And there's not a distinct central area here of ground tissue like you have over here called a pith. So that does not have a pith. So that's how it differs. That's the stems and how the tissue is arranged in the stems. Now, we will say that in the ground tissue, we're going to look at this in the leaves as well, but the ground tissue that's found in all these roots, stems, and leaves is really two major types of, or really three major types of ground tissue, and that is the parenchyma, collenchyma, and sclerenchyma. They each have different functions. We list these out in the outline here and go through the different functions of these different types of cells. We have parenchyma and collenchyma, and then we have sclerenchyma. So they either function in support for the plant body, just to help give the support. They function in metabolic processes in the plant. And photosynthesis is a process that occurs in one of these types, the parenchyma cells. So three different types of ground tissue cells. All right. The next thing we want to talk about is growth in the plant. So the plant grows, of course, if it's alive, and it grows at different sections. So in our outline here, we're at plant growth after seed germination. So the seed germinates, we'll look at that in a minute as well, but the growth process is what we want to look at. So in growth, in describing the growth in plants, we have some different terms we can use in that in description of plant growth. One of those is determinate and indeterminate growth. So these terms are implying whether this growth that we're talking about is occurring during the life of the plant, or if it and does it continue to grow the life of the plant, or is there a time period that the growth will occur and then it will not grow further, like seasonal? Is there seasonal growth involved in this? So indeterminate and determinate growth refer to that. So examples of this type of growth we mentioned in the outline. Indeterminate growth is expressed in stems and in roots. So this means that the root, as long as the plant is alive, the root will grow and get larger and longer and taller each year that it grows. And so this, we could think of it being kind of like it's genetically indeterminate. So it's not determined. It doesn't just, the root doesn't just grow to a certain length and stop. It will continue to grow. All right. And so roots and stems express this type of growth. Determinate growth would be expressed like in leaves and flowers. So the leaf is going to grow to a certain size genetically, and then it will stop growing. It's not going to grow any bigger if you give it more fertilizer and or whatever. And so it's determined, genetically determined. So you could think about us as being like expressing determinate growth. So we grow to a certain size and then we will stop. We're genetically determined. So parts of the plant are determined like that. And then other parts are not. As long as the plant's alive, it continues to grow and get longer every year. All right, so that's one way of describing growth. Another way of describing growth is the terms primary and secondary. We're going to look at that, but primary growth is growth that is when the plant gets taller. And then secondary growth is like when the plant gets wider. So we're going to look at specific examples of that. So one of the specific examples of primary growth is that which takes place at the apical meristems. All right, so the apical meristems are like the tip of the stem. So when the stems get longer, and the tip of the root as well. As the stems getting longer, you're having new growth that takes place. And growth is the same as growth in animals, that mitosis has to take place. You have to have new cells for growth. And so this is going to be the site where those new cells come from, the apical meristems for primary growth. All right, so let's look at that. And this is a tip of a root right here. All right, so right down here is where we have our apical meristem, is right here, the tip of the root. And this is, we call it meristem. It's meristematic tissue. It's tissue that is dividing. It's making new cells. All the new cells that have been produced from this are shown right here in purple. That's called the root cap, and that's where our new cells are coming out as mitosis is taking place. And so that's where growth is occurring, is right there at the apical meristem. So we see that in roots and in stems. All right, so here's apical meristem, microscopic image here of a tip of apical meristem on a stem. All right, and then secondary growth is that which takes place in the width of a plant. All right, so here we see the stem. So this is talking about the stem getting wider and wider. So you think about the trunk of a tree. When the tree grows, it gets wider and wider. If you cut it down, you can count the rings that it added a new one each year. And so we have, these are called, this secondary growth occurs at places called lateral meristems. So think about this running laterally up and down the tree or up and down the stem. And so when new cells come about through this, which is showing right here, there's two different types of lateral meristems. We have vascular cambium and we have court cambium. So here's the court cambium, here's the vascular cambium right there. So when growth occurs, we have new cells coming in at that section. So this is forming a ring around the middle there, and we have growth occurring, new cells coming in. The court cambium is in older woody plants, and you see this on the outer portion. This forms like the bark of hard woody plants like trees. All right, so that's only going to be occurring in your, this is the secondary. Both of these are examples of secondary growth. All right, so that is growth in the meristematic tissue, apical and lateral meristems. Oh, one last thing, you can look at this, you can see the rings. So again, as I mentioned, the rings, you can see each year you have new growth. That's the cells that were produced from that meristematic tissue. So if you had a lot of growth in that year, you got a wider space in between your rings. The other thing we mentioned about growth is for production. So there's different ways of describing plants for when they produce and reproduce. And so we have terms perennial, annual, and biennial. Perennial are those that live year after year, so they may go dormant and then come back. That's a perennial. So this would be our trees, shrubs, and some grasses. Biennials are those that take 2 years to complete and flower. And then annuals are those that live 1 year, they produce, they die out. Most of our agricultural crops are annual. So we plant corn, it produces corn, and then we have to replant it again next year. The last thing we mentioned in this section is talking about the reproductive structure of the plant, and that is the flower. So the flower is the sexual reproduction structure of the plant. It has both male and female structures on it. So the plants are hermaphroditic. So the male structure is called the stamen. It has an anther and a filament. And so this is where the sperm is going to be located in pollen that's produced here. The female structure is called the carpel, and it accepts that pollen with the sperm in it, and then the sperm travels down to the ovary where the eggs are, the ovules, and that's where fertilization takes place, and that's how the seed is produced. And so this goes through. Once that is fertilized, then you have a seed with that embryo in it. And the embryo, once it germinates, so germinate is the when it starts to grow, and it can remain dormant. The seed can remain dormant for long periods of time before it actually starts to grow. But once it starts to grow, the first thing to emerge is going to be the radicle or the root. Well, let's see. Before we look at that, this goes through the fertilization here. So again, the pollen is accepted on the carpel, and then we have the zygote is once that sperm from the pollen grain is fused with the egg, then we have our seed, diploid seed there. This is a dicotyledon, and you see the 2 seed leaves. But once it starts to grow after the seed germinates, then the first thing to emerge is our radicle, our embryonic root, and then we have our shoot system that will emerge after that. And that's kind of reproduction. Now, there's a lot of variation on reproduction. Plants can go through a lot of different types of asexual reproduction. We mentioned some of these in the outline. Rhizomes, tubers, bulbs, corms, stolons. Stolons are the grass, the modified stems that plants can grow from. Modified roots can produce new plants, like these trees come from the same root system. So there's a lot of variation on asexual reproduction in plants. Well, that's where we end this podcast, and the next one will begin going into plant nutrition.